Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and today we're talking about the recent news that Chinese tech executive Meng Wanzhou had reached a deferred prosecution agreement with the U.S. government, and the not-so-coincidental timing of the release of two Canadian men who had been held in prison in China since Meng's original arrest in 2018. Today, I'm joined by three guests to talk about what happened in this complicated case, what the Canadian government could or should have done better, and what it means for Canada's future relationship with China. I'm joined by lawyer Eddie Goldenberg, Carleton professor Jeremy Peltiel, and Macdonald Laurier Institute's expert on China, Charles Burton. Thank you all so much for joining me today. So let's get back to the original background of this case. Meng was arrested in 2018. Charles, can you remind our viewers exactly who Meng is and how she's viewed in China and what the charges against her were?
Yes, well, Meng Wanzhou is the chief financial officer of the Huawei Corporation, a very large international telecommunications firm based in Shenzhen in China, of which her father, Ren Zhengfei, is the founder. The basis for her detainment in Vancouver was that in August 2018, the US had put out a warrant for her arrest on the basis that she had misled the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank with regard to the status of a Huawei subsidiary, Skycom, which was doing business in Iran, thereby, through her fraud, potentially exposing the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank to being complicit in violations of US law with regard to the Skycom's business with Iran. Strangely, the Chinese government allowed Ms. Meng, who is a very senior person in the Chinese regime because of the close association of the firm Huawei with Chinese military intelligence. She came to Canada despite the fact that we have an extradition treaty with the United States. You know, that one would have thought that when her travel was being authorized by the senior levels of the party, that they would have looked at a list of nations that have extradition treaties with the United States and told her not to go to any of them. But evidently the Chinese government believed that Canada would not abide by a US extradition request because of the close relations between Canada and China. And the upshot was that on December 1st, 2018, she was detained at the Vancouver airport and spent over 1,000 days disputing the extradition.
So after she was arrested, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig were arrested in China. Professor Peltiel, can you remind our viewers about what happened with them and how it happened that they were arrested, and talk about the timing as it related to Meng's arrest?
Well, I mean, I just want to point out something that was the indictment against Ms. Meng was sealed. It was not public until the extradition request was forwarded to the Canadian government. So the Chinese government could not have known, and Ms. Meng could not have known that she was subject to arrest for fraud. So that's important. Second, but with regard to Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig is a Canadian diplomat who is on secondment to the International Crisis Group, and he was based in Hong Kong. He would go back and forth to China to do work. His brief at that point was working on North Korea. Michael Spavor is a Canadian entrepreneur, businessman, who's a kind of broker for visits to North Korea. He's most famous for brokering the visit of the former NBA star Dennis Rodman with Kim Jong-un back in 2014. They were picked up by Chinese state security 8 days after Ms. Meng and charged with violation of Chinese security laws. None of the charges have ever been detailed, and even the one trial that supposedly took place of Michael Spavor did not reveal any details other than the fact that the Global Times, then, which is a Chinese government newspaper, then revealed that Michael Spavor had been in communication with Michael Kovrig. Well, that there's nothing unusual in that. Michael Kovrig was in communication with lots of people who were dealing with North Korea.
We've got to go to commercial break, but when we come back from these messages, Eddie, I want to get your insights into what happened here.
Okay.
Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're talking about Meng and the two Michaels, Canada's diplomatic dispute with China and the detention and ultimately deferred prosecution agreement reached with the U.S. government and this Chinese tech executive. Mr. Goldenberg, Meng's dispute was not with Canada. It was with the United States. Was there anything that the Canadian government could have done to prevent this whole situation from unfolding? Could Canada have known that the U.S. had this interest in Meng and that when she entered Canada it would have created a crisis? Could they stop this from happening, and should they have?
The answer is it depends on it depends on what information Canada had ahead of time that the Americans were going to try to have her arrested in Canada. After she was arrested in Canada, the Prime Minister was at a conference in a G20 conference in South America, and he said that he had been informed in advance, and then later tried to make the argument that he really wasn't informed in advance, which I find a little bit hard to believe. I mean, it's not something that one would accept lightly. If he had been informed in advance, and it should have taken a nanosecond to understand that this would be a big problem, he should have made it very clear found a way to make it very clear to the Chinese that she better not get on that plane.
So
he didn't do that, and she arrived. After that, the Chinese, as we've talked about, took the two Michaels, and they're basically taken as hostages. Could the government have acted? I think the government could have acted, particularly after President Trump said that he was going to use her as a bargaining tool in his trade negotiations. There is a provision in the Canadian Extradition Act that would allow the Minister of Justice at any time to put an end to an extradition hearing, and they could have sent her back and made a deal to get the Michaels back. Instead, what the government did, they decided that Trump was more important than the lives of the two Canadians, frankly, in my view. And they outsourced the fate of two Canadians to Washington. And it took 2.5 years in order to have a hostage exchange, which is what happened a few weeks ago. They call it whatever they want. It was a hostage exchange.
So, Mr. Burton,
I think it could have been done earlier.
So sorry, Eddie. Mr. Burton, I want to ask you a question about the treatment of these two men when they were in China. For example, their access to lawyers, their access to consular officials, their access to basic necessities. What was their experience in China like, and how does it compare to Meng's experience while she was detained in Canada?
Well, Ms. Meng, was allowed to live in one of her two mansions in Vancouver and had a ankle bracelet. I think she was able to move around pretty freely except to go to the airport. In the case of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, they haven't given us any account of their experience, but we do know from Kevin Garrett, a Canadian coffee shop owner in Dandong, who was held in the same facility where Michael Spavor was held. In his book, Two Tears on the Window, depicted the conditions under which he lived. And he said that he was living with several other prisoners, about 24 of them. It was extremely smelly. He only got meals about 70% of the time, and the lights were on 24 hours, 7 days a week. He was subjected to several hours of relentless interrogation every day. And, in general, I think the experience was probably about as bad as one can imagine any human being should have to undergo. And in the case of Garrett, he was unhappy that, he was being imprisoned with people who had committed very serious crimes like murder and rape. So I think that certainly Michael Spavor had about the same sort of conditions as far as we understand. The Chinese violated the Vienna Convention on Consular Access by denying consular access for a protracted period. Mr. Kovrig was interrogated about matters to which he became privy as a diplomat, which was also a violation of international law. And they didn't have any due process of law, any information about their defense or proper lawyers to defend them. The thing was as Eddie said, really about hostage diplomacy.
So
I would say, Christine, I would say that the conditions were probably dreadful. And that's why I was of the view, and I wrote an article on that about 2 years ago, that for the government, the government has an obligation to Canadian citizens, and it should have done whatever it could in law, and it had the legal power to get them home. And it didn't. They outsourced it to Washington.
yeah, you had a Globe and Mail article that was asking
right.
for a prisoner exchange, and ultimately, Eddie, we only got about 15 seconds, but do you think this ultimately was a prisoner exchange?
Absolutely. Absolutely. What else was it?
When we come back from this commercial break, I want to talk to you about how the Canadian government and the Chinese government framed the arrest of the two Michaels. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing the extradition of Chinese tech executive Meng Wanzhou and the detention of two Canadian men by China, seemingly in retaliation. Professor Peltiel, I want to ask you about that perception that it was in retaliation. Did the Canadian government ever say that this was clear retaliation for the arrest of the Huawei executive? And did China ever admit anything related to that? I mean, the timing of the release of the two Canadians is certainly no coincidence.
Well, no, of course the Chinese government did not say. They said that they were arrested for violations of security law, and Chinese security laws are extremely broad, and essentially anything that the government has not yet published is secret in China. So unless they tell you, so it's possible for them to arrest her. I should also point out, and it is important from the Chinese point of view, that they viewed Ms. Meng as a hostage, and they have said so publicly on more than one occasion. That the Chinese government's point of view was that Ms. Meng was arrested at the behest of the United States in order to put pressure on them in trade and on Huawei, and that other countries had refused to detain her, but Canada had gone ahead, and they saw that as proof that Canada had colluded with the United States. They used those words, the Chinese government spokesman, that Canada had colluded with the United States in the trade dispute by arresting Ms. Meng. And the legalities of the case against Ms. Meng are quite complicated. I'm not a lawyer, but Eddie is. And the problem is that we will never know, because the case never went to court, how Justice Holmes would have decided the extradition case. And there are a number of lawyers who are actually sad about that, because it might have actually set a precedent on what the standard of evidence should be in an extradition case.
Yeah, I want to ask you, Eddie, about that extradition case, because there was never a result. Ms. Meng entered a deferred prosecution agreement with the United States. But first, why did this extradition take so long? And second, what were some of those details of the deferred prosecution arrangement, and why did she enter it?
Well, as to why it took so long, it's a complicated case, and their ability of defense lawyers normally to delay when they wanted to delay, they did it very well, and they did it in accordance with the law. Why did she enter into she was allowed to plead not guilty, no fine. Huawei itself was excluded from the deferred prosecution agreement. All she had to do was admit to a statement of facts, which you have to do in deferred prosecution agreements anyway. And there was an interesting article I read, I think it was a Reuters article, quoting two senior defense lawyers in the United States, who said that the admission of the statement of facts will be very hard to hold up in a prosecution of Huawei, because it would require her to be cross-examined, and she is not going to come back for cross-examination. So effectively, it was a face saver for the Southern District of New York, and it was this face saver for her, and she was able to get home, and the Canadians were able to come back. It was clearly well coordinated. One thing I do know is that Canadian ambassador Dominic Barton just performed miracles in Beijing. He did a tremendous job. And without him, the two Michaels would not be home. And I think she would still be facing the potential of extradition. The final point, I did see somewhere that there were also 3 Americans who had not been allowed to leave China for a number of years. They were allowed to leave at the end. So this was a deal. Canada was collateral damage 3 years ago, and it was a collateral beneficiary of a deal that was made in order to reduce tensions between China and the United States. We were just lucky on this one.
When we come back from this commercial break, I want to talk about what this is going to mean in the long term for Chinese-Canadian relations, if there's going to be any economic or diplomatic repercussions. I imagine there certainly will be. It's been quite the ordeal that these two men went through. And as you said, Eddie, it seems to be collateral damage in this case. This dispute was not ultimately with Canada, it was with the United States. We will be right back from this commercial break. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're talking about Meng and the two Michaels and Canada's future relationship with China. So, Mr. Burton, I want to ask you about that first. What do you think that this situation is going to mean for Canada's future with China? Are there going to be any political or economic consequences for what the Chinese government did to two Canadian citizens?
Well, I think that Canadian public opinion is very much opposed to returning to a policy of engagement with China and feel that the Chinese government should be made accountable for what happened. I think in general, one appreciates more and more because of this incident that China sees itself as an exceptional country that doesn't have to abide by the normal practices of diplomacy and trade because, in addition to the hostage diplomacy, we also had spurious non-tariff barriers attached to Canadian agricultural exports, specifically canola and wheat, which caused considerable losses to our farmers as a means of economic coercion over the matter. But, it may be that the government, being confident that there won't be an election anytime soon, might be prepared to engage in programming with China that most Canadians would very strongly oppose, such as approval of Huawei 5G technology into our telecommunications, or pursuing with some forms of trade agreements with China to promote Canadian prosperity. I don't think that'll go well.
Professor Peltiel, same question to you. What do you think this is going to mean for the future of Chinese-Canadian relationships, and in particular, the role of Huawei in Canada?
I think every Canadian recognizes, and most other people, that the ground has shifted under our relationship. We're not going back to where we were on December 1st, 2018. The government has already taken a free trade agreement off the table. It will probably never happen. We've also turned a cold shoulder to China over its application to join the CPTPP. I think most people believe that Huawei technology will probably be excluded from Canadian 5G networks. I think the public opinion is pretty squarely against China right now, and of course this is now more in concert with the United States and many other Western countries, and I think that in some sense it's a kind of turning point in our relationship with China, and it will not go back to where it was in December 1st, 2018, and it probably will be many years before our relationship becomes as warm as it was in 2016 when there was an exchange of visits by the prime ministers.
And Eddie, last question to you. What would you say for Canadians traveling in China? Should people be taking precautions?
I think you're safe. I actually do think you're safe in China. Look, something can happen, but I wouldn't worry about that. I think the relationship clearly will take a long time to come back, but at the same time, we can't forget there are huge economic interests, whether it's the lobster fishermen in the Atlantic, or the Port of Vancouver, the lumber industry, the farmers in Western Canada. China is the second largest economy in the world, soon to be the largest. And the international economy is very interconnected. Decoupling isn't going to happen, but it's going to take time. And I suspect that what governments are going to do, they're going to look for areas where you can cooperate, be it healthcare, be it climate change, be it sustainable development, renewable energy, areas where there are not issues of security and where they're not really issues of values. But to say that we're going to be tough on China when the president of the United States is talking to Xi, when the Germans are doing it, the French are doing it, the UK is doing it, we have to be careful that we're not Boy Scouts on this either.
Well, I want to thank all three of you for coming on today to share your expertise about this topic. I've sure learned a lot from all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We've heard today about the sad facts around the arrest and long detention of 2 Canadians by the Chinese government. Detentions that clearly were driven by retaliation for Canada's arrest of a high-ranking Chinese tech executive for extradition to the United States. Canada appeared to be in a diplomatic bind, and these 2 men paid for that with their freedom for more than 1,000 days. What could Canada have done to prevent this from happening? And what does it mean for Canada's relationship with China and the United States in the future? How would you feel about traveling to China now after what you've learned about this situation? You be the judge. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.